Georgia, I mean, basically is pulling itself completely out of the Western orbit.
Well, let's be fair here. The Georgian Dream ruling party, run by an oligarch beholden to Putin, is
right,
pulling Georgia out of Europe
right,
over
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
objections of a majority of the Georgian
right,
population,
right.
as shown by exit polls. Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a Bulwark contributor. And I'm joined this week by my strategic conscience and co-host, Eliot Cohen, the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Professor Emeritus of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Eliot, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm trying to figure out what being a strategic conscience is, whether it's like one step towards canonization and eventual sainthood. So I'm, as usual, personally, I'm fine. The weather's beautiful here. We had our family over for the holidays, but of course the season is one of doom and gloom as people think about the election. And I was wondering, Eric, it is, of course, the scene of hysteria. You and I traffic in a bit of hysteria ourselves, but also bewilderment. And I've been particularly struck when I've corresponded with friends of mine from overseas, but also American expats who've been overseas for quite a while, but care a lot about the United States. Just saying, how could this possibly happen that Donald Trump could even be close? And my view is that you and I are not in the business of dispelling hysteria, since we frequently feed it, but perhaps we could dispel some of the bewilderment. What do you think?
I'm not sure, because I'm pretty bewildered myself. I mean, by most political scientists' science measurements, this should not be a close election.
Tells you something about political science, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, or about changing, metrics, right? I mean, changing political culture, changing media environment. I mean, there are a lot of, reasons. I mean, so let me explain what I mean. Typically in the past, elections have been a sort of a retrospective referendum on the party in power. And it's usually kind of an amalgam of their job approval rating and, kind of economic conditions. Usually something like, change in disposable income in the third quarter of the year, which, of course, you can't measure until after the election is over. But, pretty usually a pretty good measure of, how people are feeling about the economy. So, for instance, in the 2012 election, when you and I were working for the Romney campaign, and at least I was convinced that Romney was going to win, I thought it was because the economy wasn't, humming along as well as it should be. Turns out the economy was growing just enough to, reelect Obama. And, so you would think, based on the economic fundamentals today, that Biden would be, cruising towards reelection. Now, of course, his approval rating is low, but also people think the economy is terrible, even though objectively the economy is, quite good. And if you look at Biden's record of legislative accomplishments anyway, pretty reasonable. Crime is down. Even the border, which is, big issue, is border entries, illegal border entries are down to a pretty low level right now. And so why is his approval so low? Why, are the polls so close? I'll give you my theory. My theory is that it comes in two parts. One part is that a lot of these metrics have changed because we are living in a very fragmented media environment, and that the media environment you and I grew up in which there were three news networks and Walter Cronkite, or depending on your preferences, Huntley and Brinkley, or Frank Reynolds and Howard K. Smith told you, sort of what the news was. Today, it's very fragmented. In fact, most young people are getting their information from sort of TikTok influencers that you and I have never heard of. That's point one. Point two is that the Biden administration came into office assuring people that its plans for some of this legislation, the Build Back Better stuff, was not going to generate inflation or additional inflationary pressures. There already were global inflationary pressures that were resulting from COVID. It wasn't good. Inflation was going to be transient. And despite warnings from people like, Larry Summers, who's, no right-wing conservative, they insisted on saying this for a while. They also insisted on saying there was no problem at the border, and crime wasn't a problem. And I think it was sort of the sense that they were whistling past the graveyard about all of these things when Americans were going to the grocery store and saying, yeah, inflation's a problem. And it was quite persistent. I mean, it's coming down now, but it was quite persistent, which led to a ratcheting up of interest rates and increased borrowing costs for aspiring young homeowners. All of this contributed to a sense that they didn't really kind of know what they were doing, which was then compounded by the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, which shattered their reputation for competence. And I think that, therein lies, I think, the tale of why people don't, see this as a successful administration and therefore are willing to contemplate a return of Trump, notwithstanding everything that Trump has done that ought to be disqualifying. Anyway, that's my account.
All right. Well, speaking as your conscience, I would like you to do a really, a bit of soul searching about your kind of neo-Marxism, crude economic determinism in terms of understanding American elections. I'm going to go back to the Romney campaign. My heart said we have a chance, and probably like you, I remember just watching TV at about 9:30 or whenever it was that they declared for Obama, feeling like somebody had hit me over the head with a really big soft mallet, and I just kind of stunned and poured myself a stiff drink. And but the reason why my head thought that Obama would win is because I just couldn't imagine the United States firing its first black president for anything other than some sort of egregious misconduct. And there was no egregious misconduct. There was, you and I agree in our fundamental assessment of the Obama presidency, that was worse than it looked, particularly on foreign policy. So my interpretation is, I agree with a lot of what you said, but it is somewhat different. I think that, and I should explain that part of what this is driven by is talking to a lot of people close to me who probably were not thinking of voting for Trump, but were thinking of not voting out of disgust with both sides. A good example of this in the public realm, by the way, would be our friend Bret Stephens from the New York Times, who kind of reluctantly came around to saying that he's going to vote for Harris, but with, about every possible qualifier. So I think it's actually a lot deeper. I think first, and by the way, I think some of the best commentary on this have come from people like from Bret, from David French, also I would say from David Brooks too, who I don't always agree with, that the big mistake that the left wing of the Democratic Party makes has been this kind of racial reductionism, that everything, that identity politics is the only thing that matters. And I think one of them said, no, actually, it's much more now about class. And what I would say is it's profoundly about culture. And that what you're seeing here is a kind of a cumulative wave of resentment, which has parallels in other countries, to include Canada, to include New Zealand, which we don't pay that much attention to. And, we may eventually see it in Britain as well, to the, first the DEI, defund the police, the whole kind of blowing of issues of sexual identity way out of proportion to the real issues, which are real, and the kind of general censoriousness.
So partially you agree with my neo-Marxist analysis, at least on
No,
the
I do
class
not agree.
piece. And the
I do,
class piece, you said class and culture. So at least classes, you
well,
know,
that's if you have a crude economic understanding of
okay,
class as opposed to the higher understanding of
I see.
class, which I would consider in its essence Tocquevillian.
Yeah, look,
Uh,
look, I concede all those points. I mean, I think that's been a part of this as well. I mean, all the cultural points you make.
but I mean, I think what people really grossly underestimate is just how fed up people are with it, and it keeps on getting reinforced by lots of things. So, for example, the COVID stuff, the people I think know very well that the restrictions that were introduced during COVID did a lot of damage to kids. In some cases, were not necessary. Um, and what they resent was the kind of the sense of certainty that was projected by sort of an elite expert community talking down to them. I think one of the reasons why people, there was an element of racism undoubtedly in some of the hostility to Obama, but some of it was also tone. A tone which, by the way, persists. When Obama is lecturing black men about you just have to get over the idea of supporting a woman, when maybe there are actually other things that are driving some of them to think about Trump. So and it just continues. When people look at the campuses these days, and they see some of the behaviors that you've seen with demonstrations, but they also hear things like 80% of the kids get A's, or the Biden administration says, yes, we want to forgive everybody's college loans, and they're essentially going to be paid for by the working stiffs who don't go to college or whose kids don't go to college. So and it's really been in many ways, I think, unrelenting. And then I think it's gotten worsened by the way the Democrats. First, I mean, I have a somewhat darker view of the Biden presidency, but the way people kind of covered up for the fact that he clearly is beyond it, and that he clearly is too old. And there was just this gaslighting of the American public by saying, how dare you say that he's too old? He's not too old. He's perfectly clear on. No, it's not true, and it was palpably not true when you saw it. And then on the other hand, I think there is a profound tendency of people like us to underestimate the appeal of Trump's ability to seem like an average guy. And I hate to say it that way because he's loathsome and horrible. And I would never vote for him. And as people know, I'm supporting Harris. But he talks the way a lot of people talk. He can carry off handing out French fries at a McDonald's quite well. I mean, I take seriously the idea that he learned some of this
Kind of,
early
sort
on.
of, although the whole thing was totally staged.
Oh, of course, it's completely staged. Actually, so you wanted something really chilling? I was last night. I tracked down on YouTube. I'm always looking for something to watch while I work out and try to forget the pain. So I've decided I'm going to watch The World at War, this wonderful series done in the early 70s with Laurence Olivier narrating, I think like 26, 29 episodes, something like that. The first episode is about the rise of Hitler. And there's, all the Nazi elite, and they're handing out food, in soup kitchens, and they're going to communal meals, and it's complete fake because we know how they actually lived. But there were a number of very uncomfortable overtones. But in any case, the fact is that he comes across that way, and it's also the case, I think, that there's been this sort of intellectual softening up by the kind of the old Paleolithic or isolationist right. I would single out, among others, people like Ross Douthat, who can't write a column without saying, well, this is all the fault of George W. Bush and the Iraq War, which I think is palpable nonsense. But the point is that stuff has been repeated a lot. It is a useful stick. So J.D. Vance, who to my mind, gets more and more sinister by the day, say, "Oh yeah, if you're not in favor of us, you're a warmonger," and he spends most of his time attacking the Bush administration. So I think it's all those things coming together, and then Harris herself, who's in some ways quite an attractive personality, I think. It's not clear that she has a governing philosophy. She may have one. It may just be that as a lawyer, she doesn't feel comfortable articulating something until she's studied the brief to death. But she hasn't. She's a very persuasive critic of Trump. It's absolutely clear that she's, basically someone with integrity and, who will respect the Constitution and the rule of law and all that. But if you were to ask me,
just a minor issue.
Yeah, but if you were to ask me what's her governing philosophy, I don't know that I could give a good answer. Could you?
Yeah. Look, I take a lot of what you say, but let me push back. Well, let me pick up a couple of different threads. One, I certainly agree that there's been this effort to kind of sane wash Trump. And Ross Douthat in the Times is a particularly egregious example. I wrote in the Bulwark.
Yes, tell people about this article that you read, which is very good, which I was going to bring up later, but you could much just speak to it.
He interviewed Robert O'Brien and Bridge Colby, who are he presents as two mainstream traditional Republican foreign policy types. Reagan Republicans who believe that Trump will govern in a second term as a kind of peace through strength, but with a kind of populist, frisson, if you will. I explain it in the article why, there's a lot of, memory holing different things, including the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which they lay completely at Biden's doorstep, which in fact, began under Trump who agreed to the Doha agreement with the Taliban, never held the Taliban to account for actually abiding by it, and then bequeathed his negotiator, Zal Khalilzad, to the Biden people who kept him on and had the same military commanders in place. It's like, so what reason does anybody have to believe that had Trump actually been reelected, that the Afghanistan withdrawal would have gone one iota differently from how it actually went in August of 2021? Probably would have happened earlier because they were operating under an earlier deadline. Biden actually extended the deadline by several months. The idea that Trump rebuilt the military when he had 2 years of 3% growth and then flat defense budgets. Some other myths that have been perpetuated. The notion that we could simply prioritize the Indo-Pacific and let our European allies and Middle East partners fend for themselves, which one would think has been disproven by what's happened in Ukraine and in the Middle East since October 7th last year, but which still kind of lives on in some precincts of Trumpism, including the ones inhabited by J.D. Vance. This is all just completely fanciful. The idea that Trump in a second term would actually levy heavy sanctions on Russia in order to get an agreement, force the two sides to negotiate. There's actually, no evidence for this. Trump, in fact, has said he wants to lift all sanctions. If you think the Indo-Pacific matters, he's basically said, I don't think we should defend Taiwan. So this is all a sort of totally, magical realism conjured up by apologists, essentially, for Trump.
I agree with that, and of course, it's one of the reasons why in our branch of the foreign policy establishment, and you and I are both, for better or for worse, members of it, you'll find very, very little doubt that you're much better off with Harris on all kinds of grounds. I think, again, just in the interest of trying to get people unbewildered but not unhysterical, I think the kind of And the average Joe said, "Yep," would say, "Yeah. I mean, that's true. Like he talks these terrible things." But when you look at the last time he was in office, we didn't pull out of NATO. He actually, more arms went to Ukraine than under Obama. Abraham Accords, well, that's pretty good. Tough on China, yeah. Well, Biden's tough on China, and so why not now? I think you and I would say, look, that was the first term. There were very different circumstances. You had the Mattises and the Tillersons and the Boltons. I mean, really almost all the way through to the end of the administration. You're not going to have that here. I mean, you'd be pinning your hopes on the likes of Tom Cotton and Mike Pompeo. But let's
in
face
the best
it,
of circumstances.
in the best of, yeah, but there's also you could have Rick Grinnell and Kash Patel and other horrors. So I think that's right. But I think I actually, the reason why I raised this, Eric, was not really for the fun of it, but because I think people will make a big mistake if they simply let themselves be bewildered by this, as opposed to trying to understand what's going on. And for better or for worse, let's assume that Harris, as I devoutly hope, wins a clear-cut victory. You're still going to need to step back and say, okay, well, why did that happen? And instead of just tearing your hair out, and I don't have any hair left to tear, let's try to figure out, where the country's head is on a whole bunch of these issues and where to go forward. I think, the challenge for Harris, look, the mistake that Biden made, and in a way you could say it was a mistake that Trump made, and possibly even that Obama made, was to try to run as if they had these decisive mandates, when in fact you're dealing with a
very divided
country that in some respects is split 50-50. And, the problem is everybody gets intoxicated by victory. The Labour Party in Britain is actually a wonderful case study of this. With considerably less than 40% of the vote, they got this huge margin in Parliament, and they're just, falling all over themselves day after day, apparently under the illusion that they have a mandate from the broad British people, which they don't.
Right. No, I take that point. I mean, look, we probably should wrap up this segment because there's a whole big wide world over, outside, and we're falling prey to to the American conceit that, the only thing that matters is us and our election. But I guess I would say the one good piece of news here, I agree with what you say about a deeply divided country and the danger that people have, acting as if they have a mandate. By the way, I would say Bush 43,
unquestionably. Same thing. Exactly the same thing.
So I mean, there's plenty of, blame to go around for that. I would say this, though, that gives me, God forbid we actually have a hopeful moment on this show. But look, I think the most encouraging thing that I've seen, and not just because she's a personal friend, but that is that Liz Cheney has been out there campaigning with Kamala Harris, and Kamala Harris has done that despite the fact that there are any number of voices on the left, Jon Stewart, other move on types, saying, "Oh, why are we doing this thing?" With Cheney, which I think is an indication that Harris means what she says when she says she's going to be president for all Americans. Now, who knows? I mean, we'll see what happens.
No, but I'm completely with you on that.
I think there's signs that she understands that the country is divided,
yes,
and that she's going to have to govern from the center, and not give as much obeisance or deference to the woke left of the Democratic Party that you were inveighing against earlier, that I think Biden did in the certainly in the early part of his administration. And so I think there's some room for hope. I think.
Oh, I agree. So, all right. Well, so now everybody is still hysterical, but no longer bewildered.
We'll see. We may be more bewildered after the election. Who knows?
What do you want to talk about next?
Well, I'd like to talk about the Israeli response to the Iranian October 1 largest ballistic missile strike by one nation state on another in history. Um, and here I've got plenty of criticisms of the Biden administration. But here I would say I think the dialogue between the Biden administration and the government of Israel that led to the outcome we've seen is actually a pretty good outcome. And I think there's been some talk that maybe the Israelis didn't hit back hard enough. My reading is different. I mean, I think that the strikes that they executed showed, first of all, that they have rendered Iran essentially defenseless to air and missile attack by Israel by destroying all of Iran's advanced air defense radars. By the way, not a very good advertisement for S-300, for Russian defense technology, and nice bit of advertising for the F-35 for U.S. defense technology. I think they took out, the plants that mix the solid motor rocket fuel for ballistic missiles, which will be extremely difficult for Iran to replace. It could be at least a year or so, at least a year, I think, before they'll be able to, replace that. They took out the high explosive chamber at Parchin, where Iran, which is actually a part of Iran's nuclear weapons program, where they were doing high explosive testing to help develop nuclear warhead design. They have taken out some other missile production facilities at other air bases, IRGC facilities around the country, and they've basically left Iran with the following message: we can reach out and touch you anywhere we like now. We can do leadership targeting. We've already shown we can do that by killing Nasrallah and Safiuddin and any number of other, Hezbollah and Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar, et cetera. We can reach out and touch any of your energy infrastructure. We didn't do it this time, but we could. We can reach out and touch your nuclear program, because we've already shown you we can do that. And we can attack any of your military facilities we want. And I think that, is a very good deterrent message to have left. We'll see whether the Iranians decide whether they want another round of this or not. They might feel they have to respond, but I think right now they've got a lot to think about.
I agree. I mean, my understanding, you covered very well what they hit. My understanding is that part of, I don't know if they got all of the S-300s that Iran has, but they got the S-300s apparently that covered the oil facilities. So there's a very pointed warning there too, that if we want to, those can go, and that would be pretty disastrous. It's also interesting that they took out air defenses en route in Syria and Iraq, and that we, we've got American troops in Iraq, and in theory, we've got a working relationship with the Iraqi government. We didn't complain about that. There's a bit of a message, I think, to the Iraqi government in all that. I think, one of the things I find. I guess two thoughts. One is. This is part of an escalation of the confrontation between Israel and Iran, which has been going on for a very, very long time. But it's really now at the level of direct hostilities. Both sides have now thrown punches at each other directly. And who knows where this is going to go from there. I mean, what the Iranians may try to do, and of course, they still haven't really retaliated effectively for the Hania assassination in Tehran. What they may try to do is attack a Jewish community overseas, as they did in Buenos Aires in whatever it was. It was quite some time ago, 83 or something. There's that. I think the other thing that's, this is sort of cold-blooded of me, but that interests me as a student of just military affairs, is that we're now in a world where, with long-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, people can wage what are essentially strategic bombing campaigns. Now, not at the same level that a country like the United States can. It's not comparable to World War II, but it's still pretty impressive. And it can be done over the heads of other countries. It can be done with a fair amount of precision. And I wouldn't say that anybody can do it, but a lot of places can do it. I mean, the Russians obviously can do it to the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians, as they've shown increasingly, can do it to the Russians. And so there's a different military setting. One other thing I would say about where the Israelis are, and as you know, I'll be heading over there. And when I get back, we'll want to chat about that. I think the Israelis have now moved to a very different strategic paradigm than they've had for a while. They've gone through different paradigms in the course of their history. When they were created, it was, you immediately retaliate for anything that's done to you, but it's sort of like an eye for a tooth kind of retaliation. They went through a period, I think, really from 56, certainly through 67, of thinking, okay, preemptive war, if you see something coming down the pike and you really try to achieve a major operational level theater decision. More recently, their approach to dealing with Hamas or Hezbollah is mow the grass. So, you sprinkle force around when things seem to be getting out of hand, but you're not trying to do anything root and branch. I think they're now in a period where, because they believe with perfectly good reason that they're facing existential challenges, and certainly opponents who have existential aims, that they're really going to try to use military power to, in some ways, reshape Middle Eastern politics. Now, that's a very tall order, but I think in some ways they're successful. I was just reading the very interesting piece in The Economist, sort of saying, actually, the kind of level of assassination that they've been doing may work, despite what the political science literature says, that they may be able to, that these are not, Hamas and Hezbollah are not ideas, they're institutions. And those institutions are getting battered in a way that we have never seen before. And I think there may be something to that. Now, there are a lot of factors at play, but my point is these things will not end there. The Middle East that's going to come out of this will look quite different. I guess the thing I'd want to ask you is, what do you think the prospects of this more kind of root and branch approach might be?
So a couple of thoughts. One, on the long range fires, missiles, cruise missiles, drones. Obviously, this is part of an ongoing, change in the character of war. We talked about some of this last week with Mick Ryan. I think, the barriers to entry here are very low. Obviously, you've got not just countries like Iran, but non-state actors like Hezbollah and Hamas with, large inventories of these weapons. They're going to spread to everybody eventually. And I think it means, among other things, that our own homeland will not be a sanctuary if there's another, conflict in the future. Potentially, we will be subject to these kinds of attacks. Point one. Point two is, I think it is very impressive to see the work that has been done by both Israel and the United States in integrated air and missile defense, and some of the work done with Ukraine. But I think that while those efforts are necessary and continue, we need to think of them as sort of interim capabilities to protect populations in the here and now. But I think we need massive investment in the long run. And when I say we, I mean not just the United States, but its NATO allies, its Middle East partners, its Indo-Pacific partners in directed energy weapons, high-powered microwaves, lasers, things like that, that reduce the cost per shot of defense and give you essentially a bottomless magazine. Because we already see that Israel is running out of interceptors. Ukraine, there's a global shortage of missile defense interceptors. And while I'm all in favor of throwing money at the problem and ramping up production, We don't want to find ourselves on the wrong side of the cost, imposition curve. I think what Israel has done to Hezbollah and Hamas has been, in many ways, brilliant. Particularly Hezbollah. I mean, the exquisite intelligence that they've had, and the way that they've handled the response to Iran, I think, has been commendable. I get nervous when people start talking about we're going to reshape the Middle East.
I'm with you.
That's
what I was putting to you as a question.
Yeah, it makes me very nervous, and not because I don't think they should be pummeling Hezbollah and retaliating against Iran. It's that in the end of the day, it's the people in the Middle East who have to reshape their environment. I don't think Israel or we or anybody else can do it. Now, I'm not opposed to giving those people the chance to do it. I mean, that's why I think we should be doing much more to help the people of Iran who absolutely loathe the regime to try and replace it on their own, as Iranians have done historically in the past. It's why I took the positions I did on the war in Iraq back in 2003. But the idea that Israel is going to reshape the region, I mean, there's some things that can be done with diplomacy that will reshape the region, and there's some military prerequisites for that. So I think some of what they're doing can lead to reshaping the region, but it can't be just done with the military instrument, right? So obviously, normalization with Saudi Arabia would be a big step towards reshaping the region. But I think that's going to require a ceasefire in Gaza. And by the way, I think it's not just that requires a ceasefire in Gaza. I think I do not want to see Israel involved in a long-term permanent occupation of Gaza. And I don't want to see Israel annexing, God forbid, Gaza or parts of Gaza. I mean, nothing I think could be more damaging ultimately to the fate of the Jewish state than that.
I completely agree on all that. I mean, certainly, and I think the Israelis don't want occupation. There are some nuts who would like to return to some of the settlements there, which Sharon wisely evacuated, although unwisely basically failed to hand over to the PA rather than Hamas. But I guess my question, before we perhaps turn to some of the less prominent but actually quite disturbing events in Europe and Central Asia, what should be the Israeli objectives then?
I think the objective should be a ceasefire in Gaza that turns the day-to-day security over to an international authority that uses private military companies to provide the security. Because I don't believe any nation state's going to want its soldiers there, and I don't think you want them there. You want people who are actually going to pull the trigger and kill Hamas guys when they try and intimidate the population. And that Israel then establishes a reinforced security perimeter around Gaza. And I think you need some special measures along the Philadelphia corridor to prevent it from once again becoming an entrepot to more military equipment, rockets, missiles, the precursors for that, et cetera. And then the governance piece ultimately has to go to some version, hopefully rebuilt, of the PA that is more responsible. And maybe we could get, if you could get a ceasefire, if you could start to get Israeli troops out and some kind of security force in there, then maybe you could get the Gulf Arabs to get serious about imposing some kind of reform agenda on the Palestinians, since the money for reconstruction is going to have to partially come from the Gulf.
Do you think PMCs? Do you think private military companies could do that? Could actually do an adequate job of providing security?
I think so. If you got enough, if you had enough people, I think you need about 30,000-40,000 people to do it. But I think you could do it. I mean, and who else is going to do it?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's not Israel, and I mean, I don't, the idea of some multinational Arab force, you think
No.
those guys are going to pull
No.
triggers against Hamas
No.
people?
No.
I just,
And
Unifil?
Unifil too. No.
Yeah, right. So,
Yeah.
so that's the first stage. Second stage, I think they do need agreement like the one the Biden administration is pursuing to actually, enforce 1701 and get Hezbollah north of the Litani and get Israelis back into the towns and farms and villages in the north so they can return to some kind of normalcy. Um, and from there, I mean, you could, I think, see your way clear to uh, you know Saudi normalization, et cetera. And that, frankly, if you could accomplish, 2/3 of what I just said, that would already be a lot, to accomplish in a short while. We should, you want to turn to Europe and Central Asia, but there is one kind of Asia-Europe piece here that we need to talk about, which is the deployment of North Korean troops to Russia to fight in Kursk against the Ukrainians. This to me validates a lot of what we said in the National Defense Strategy Commission about the intensifying cooperation among Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and is very serious, it seems to me. I mean,
Yeah, I completely agree. It is extremely serious, and one of the problems is there are plenty more where those came from. I mean, the North Korean regime doesn't particularly care until it jeopardizes its own security. How many people get killed? We know what Russian tactics are like, so they'll use them for meat assaults. The one way in which I think it could backfire somewhat, or to some extent already has. The South Koreans have been paying attention to this. They are understandably quite concerned about, okay, what are the quid pro quos that North Korea is getting from Russia in all this. My sense is the Chinese are not entirely happy about it, but I mean, not enough to really seriously damage the Sino-Russian relationship. It is a very big deal. This, by the way, is another one where the Biden administration has basically been silent. I mean, what did they I mean, there, and
Secretary Austin said it was a very serious matter, but he's the only one who's made a public statement that I'm aware of.
And
maybe Kirby may have said something, but I mean,
but you have to do something which, beyond saying it's a very serious situation. I mean, you'd say that if there was, I don't know, contamination of the drinking water and some American military outpost in Belgium or something. And the thing is, you're not going to really kind of motivate the Europeans unless the United States is banging on the table and saying this is a very big deal. I think some of the Europeans are quite concerned by this.
Mark Rutte, the new NATO Secretary General, made a statement today. But here's the thing, so for all the chatter, all the talk, around Washington about this has to end in negotiation. We need to start pushing the Ukrainians to negotiate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're Vladimir Putin and you think, wow, I've got, as you were saying, a virtually endless stream of North Koreans who I can pretend are like the Tuvans and Buryats and Yakuts and other ethnic minorities that I've been allowing to be sent to the slaughter in Ukraine without creating a political problem for myself in European Russia. Well, yeah, why wouldn't you do it ad infinitum? What reason would you possibly have to negotiate as you're creeping back more and more of the territory in Donbass? And, eventually, if you get enough of these bodies to throw at the salient in Kursk, push the Ukrainians out of Kursk. Why would you negotiate anything?
I agree, and this is compounded by the other thing we were going to talk about, which is the Georgian elections and Russian pressure in Moldova. I mean, so just Georgia, I mean, basically is pulling itself completely out of the Western orbit.
Let's be fair here. The Georgian Dream ruling party, run by an oligarch beholden to Putin, is pulling Georgia out of Europe over the objections of a majority of the Georgian population, as shown by exit polls.
Absolutely. And, the thing is, this is another way in which the Russians are achieving successes. And, the indispensable thing for the United States is to rally the Europeans to this, because they're, the look. I mean, a way to go back to the beginning. On the one hand, you might say, well, Trump has a point. The Europeans are all wealthy, and it's their continent, so why can't they get their act together? The fact is, you can't get your act together unless you have a leader. There is no leader of Europe. It can't be the Brits, in part because of Brexit, but really it's not just Brexit. It can't be France, because the French irritate too many people. It can't be Germany, because Germany is still
history.
There's history. It's not going to be the Poles, because the people, West Europeans, still kind of turn up their noses at East Europeans, and they think the Poles are crazy. There is no alternative leadership. I mean, we wish that there were, but there isn't. So it has to be the United States that's leading the charge, and you cannot lead the charge unless you're talking. I mean, this is one way in which you and I have talked about this often enough. When people dismiss diplomacy, they, to some extent, are dismissing the importance of speech, public speech and private speech. And but that's all that leadership often is. I mean, how much of Churchill's leadership during the critical phases of World War II was about speeches? It's about what he said.
Reagan,
or Kennedy. I mean, or FDR. And in all these respects, it is a terrible indictment of the Biden administration. That Biden he was never a great speaker to begin with, but basically, particularly since his decline became more pronounced, he's practically mute, and it's a terrible thing.
Well, so we talked about Georgia. I mean, there's also elections and referendum in Moldova about EU association, and that appears to have passed by the skin of its teeth, but largely, essentially, on the expat Moldovan vote in Europe, and in the face of a very concerted Russian effort to manipulate the election, as we're seeing in Georgia as well. So Russia is, being very active, of course, interfering in our election campaign also, as we saw with the, fake video that clearly came from a Russian disinformation source, as the FBI has stated. That showed, Trump ballots being ripped up. I think it was in Pennsylvania, but could have been any one of the battleground states. So this is an ongoing, effort at political warfare that Russia is waging against us. And, I just don't see that we're doing much, to wage political warfare in response.
I agree with you.
I mean, in the first instance, it seems to me that we ought to have, and there's a way to do it. I know that there's a concern that it appears to be partisan because so much of the Russian effort is about electing Trump. Well, fine. The Iranian effort is about defeating Trump and electing Harris. So you can talk about all of these things and basically, I think, call them out for what they are. Say that we're not going to tolerate it. Say that we're going to, as we did, as Bob Mueller did, we're going to identify these people, we're going to sanction them, and we're going to indict them, if appropriate, if they, we can, catch them breaking U.S. laws. We're going to indict them, and we're making it impossible for them to travel around the world. We're going to put out Interpol notifications, et cetera. And then, there are other things we can do, on the black side of things to retaliate against some of these.
Well, I just wanted to say that. I mean, this is a subject for a longer conversation with maybe somebody like Peter Pomerantsev again. We need to be on offense and not just on defense. All right, this is really depressing. We have only 5 minutes left. Let's talk about something more. Something more cheerful. What you reading?
I'm reading Susan Dunn's Blueprint for Mobilization. about FDR's efforts in 1940, before the war began, to prepare the war, the United States for the prospect of war. And I've obviously been thinking a lot about this because of the work we did on the NDS Commission and the state of our defense and industrial base. And I pointed out recently to a senior defense official that in 1938 already FDR was saying publicly in speeches that the resources we were providing for defense were not adequate to the growing challenges the United States was facing. People criticize FDR for being very cautious and moving with public opinion, and you and I have talked about this in the past. He had a lot of public opinion difficulties to manage, but as early as 38, he was saying we don't have adequate resources for defense, which, to your earlier point about leadership, you have to play straight with the American people and treat them like adults and explain to them.
Yeah.
What we're facing.
Although he could be quite slippery, as where he, in the presidential campaign in 1940, says, I'm not going to send your sons to fight in a foreign war. Although, I think it was in 38 that he said we need to build 10,000 aircraft, which was a staggering number, which beyond our capability. But he thought it was always good to set people those targets. Is this a recent book?
It's a couple of years old. She's a colleague of James McGregor Burns at Williams College, and she's written a number of books on. She's also written quite a good book on the 1940 election, called 1940, by the way.
Why do we should get her on? So I've been reading two things. One, in the nonfiction realm, I've been going further back. I've been reading Command of the Ocean by N.A.M. Roger. This is part of a magnificent 3-volume naval history of Great Britain. Huge books. I mean, really whacking big volumes. And the third volume, The Price of Victory, which is the Royal Navy from 1815 to 1945, just came out. The one I'm reading is basically from the
Elizabethans.
No, it's actually from the Restoration up to 1815. So it includes the Napoleonic Wars. And he's a terrific historian, and he covers many different dimensions of naval power. One thing that really strikes me is that you see in that book, one of the things you really can see is it's the little things which actually frequently give you the edge. So, for example, everybody has to worry about things like scurvy, but on the whole, British ships were healthier than French and Spanish ships because they were fanatical about cleanliness. To include like the latrines and stuff, or heads, I should say, or the auxiliary sciences like hydrography. I mean, it's the British who are really taking the lead in charting ports and so on all over the world. So they actually have much better charts than everybody else. Or the way in which, the Industrial Revolution really in some ways starts not with weaving, it starts with the manufacture of blocks for pulleys and stuff like that, and somebody coming up with a way of mass producing them. So it's all these sort of auxiliary aspects of military power. That's fascinating. But then the other thing I read was a light read. I've been going back and rereading things that I enjoyed enormously when I was considerably younger. And of course, you see things in them that you didn't see before. And what I just finished rereading was Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, which is a terrific, it's basically a collection of stories about the colonization of Mars. And of course, what it really is a picture of the United States in the 50s. Then when you read it, you really see that he's using the device of the settlement of Mars to tell you some of the good things about the United States and some of the not so good things about the United States. So I have to say it's kind of whetted my appetite to read a bit more science fiction.
Well, I think that's always a good thing. I'm a huge science fiction fan. But I hate to throw cold water on this discussion, but I am thinking that maybe Elon Musk has been reading it as well, because he just was talking about we're going to be on Mars in 2 years.
Well, I think he should lead the way.
Yeah, that would be good.
I think that would be. I think that would. We should have a discussion. We're out of time, but we should have a discussion sometime about what does it mean when you in a world where you have that massive, staggering kind of wealth.
We should be talking about do we want oligarchs running the United States of America?
Right, and there, there is. I mean, I'll just say that in ancient Athens, when a single man grew to be too big, they ostracized him
for good reason.
For very good reason.
Yeah, I'm with you. Well, I think that we'll have to wrap it up for this episode. I'm glad we ended on a lighter note than normal, although there was plenty of doom and gloom to go around today.
Yeah. No, we were ending this with Elon Musk going off to Mars.
Well, we'll have a special guest next week while you're traveling, who from personal experience, I hope, will tell us why Donald Trump is unfit to be president, but also what to expect from a Trump or Harris presidency and foreign policy. And then we'll have you back to give us a trip report when you get back from Israel. Safe travels.
Thanks.